Inspired by the network of high-speed roads he saw in Germany during World War II, Dwight D. Eisenhower championed the passing of the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. The law funded the first 41,000 miles of paved glory that made up the early U.S. Interstate System, which now boasts 46,876 miles and runs through all 50 states. Yes, even Alaska and Hawaii. Today, we will tell you everything about the U.S. Interstate Highway System, the world's most expensive highway project. 14. It took 17 years to create and fund the idea of the interstate. Two members of the U.S. Bureau of Public Roads presented a report to Congress in 1939 that detailed the need for a non-tolled road system in the U.S. The Federal Highway Act of 1944 allowed for development of a 40,000-mile national system of interstate highways, but it didn't provide any method of funding, so it went nowhere. It wasn't until the Act of 1956 that funding was finally allocated to its construction. The official name of this highway system is known as Dwight D. Eisenhower National System of Interstate and Defense Highways. This was named after the President Dwight Eisenhower, who championed the highway system and signed the FAHA, Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, into law. This idea came into his mind from his time in Germany as general in the U.S. Army during World War II. 13. A nation of drivers. This was about to change. In 1908, Henry Ford introduced the Model T, a dependable, affordable car that soon found its way into many American garages. By 1927, the year that Ford stopped making this Tin Lizzie, the company had sold nearly 15 million of them. At the same time, Ford's competitors had followed its lead and began building cars for everyday people. Automobiling was no longer an adventure or a luxury, it was a necessity. A nation of drivers needed good roads, but building good roads was expensive. Who would pay the bill? In most cities and towns, mass transit, streetcars, subways, elevated trains, was not truly public transportation. Instead, it was usually built and operated by private companies that made enormous infrastructural investments in exchange for long-term profits. However, automobile interests, such as car companies, tire manufacturers, gas station owners, and suburban developers, hoped to convince state and local governments that roads were a public concern. That way, they could get the infrastructure they needed without spending any of their own money. Their campaign was successful. In many places, elected officials agreed to use taxpayer money for the improvement and construction of roads. In most cases, before 1956, the federal government split the cost of road building with the states. One exception was the New Deal, when federal agencies like the Public Works Administration and the Works Progress Administration put people to work building bridges and parkways. However, this funding arrangement did not get roads built fast enough to please the most ardent highway advocates. 12. The last call of the wild. Today, there are more than 250 million cars and trucks in the United States, or almost one per person. At the end of the 19th century, by contrast, there was just one motorized vehicle on the road for every 18,000 Americans. At the same time, most of those roads were not made of asphalt or concrete, but of packed dirt, on good days, or mud. Under these circumstances, driving a motor car was not simply a way to get from one place to another. It was an adventure. Outside cities and towns, there were almost no gas stations or even street signs, and rest stops were unheard of. Automobiling, said the Brooklyn Eagle newspaper in 1910, was the last call of the wild. 11. People first loved, then hated it. When the Interstate Highway Act was passed, most Americans thought it was a good idea. But when construction started and people, especially in urban areas, were displaced and communities cut in half, some started to revolt. In the 1960s, activists stopped construction on highways in New York, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and New Orleans, which resulted in several urban interstates becoming roads to nowhere. 10. Every state owns its portion, including the potholes. This means the state is responsible for enforcing traffic laws and maintaining the section of highway and its borders. Currently, the largest pothole in the country award has been claimed by the section of I-75 outside Detroit. 9. Except for one former bridge. The Woodrow Wilson Memorial Bridge, I-95/495, that crossed the Potomac River into Washington, D.C., used to be the only part of the interstate system owned by the Federal Highway Administration. But issues over it being too small led to the creation of a new, bigger, taller bridge. As for the old one, it was destroyed, in part by people who won a contest for having the toughest daily drive. 8. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. It took several years of wrangling, but a new Federal Aid Highway Act passed in June 1956. The law authorized the construction of a 41,000-mile network of interstate highways that would span the nation. It also allocated $26 billion to pay for them. Under the terms of the law, the federal government would pay 90% of the cost of expressway construction. The money came from an increased gasoline tax, now 3 cents a gallon instead of 2, that went into a non-divertible highway trust fund. The new interstate highways were controlled access expressways with no at-grade crossings. That is, they had overpasses and underpasses instead of intersections. They were at least 4 lanes wide and were designed for high-speed driving. They were intended to serve several purposes: eliminate traffic congestion, replace what one highway advocate called undesirable slum areas with pristine ribbons of concrete, make coast-to-coast transportation more efficient, and make it easy to get out of big cities in case of an atomic attack. 7. The states set the speed limits. However, in the early 1970s, all 50 states set their speed limits to 55 miles per hour. A clause in the Emergency Highway Energy Conservation Act signed into law by Richard Nixon dictated that if a state did not set its highway speed limit to 55 miles per hour, that state would lose its federal highway funding. 6. The signs are trademarked. The red, white, and blue shields used to designate interstate numbers are trademarked by the American Association of State Highway Officials. The original design for the shield was drawn by senior traffic engineer Richard Oliver of Texas and selected out of 100 entries in a national design competition in 1957. On 1 or 2-digit interstates, the mile marker numbering almost always begins at the southern or western state line. If an interstate originates within a state, the numbering begins from the location where the road begins in the south or west. Exceptions exist for interstate highways that use segments of roadway that were built prior to interstate highway standards being formalized and were grandfathered into the system. Exit numbers correspond to interstate mileage markers in most states. Many northeastern states label exit numbers sequentially, regardless of how many miles have passed between exits. 5. The Highway Revolt. When the Interstate Highway Act was passed, most Americans supported it. Soon, however, the unpleasant consequences of all that road building began to show. Most unpleasant of all was the damage the roads were inflicting on the city neighborhoods in their path. They displaced people from their homes, sliced communities in half, and led to abandonment and decay in city after city. 4. Interstates and highways with the same number cannot run through the same state. The numbering system used for interstates is intended to be the mirror opposite of the US highway system, so drivers won't be confused about whether to take Highway 70 or Interstate 70. For example, I-10 runs through southern states east-west, as all major even-numbered interstates do. Odd-numbered interstates run north-south, while Highway 10 runs through northern states. Because I-50 would run through the same states as Route 50, the number will never be used. 3. I-99 doesn't follow this system, but that's not the Federal Highway Administration's fault. According to the Federal Highway Administration's numbering system, Pennsylvania's former US 220 should have been named something like I-876 or I-280, but Representative Bob Schuster wanted a catchier moniker for it. According to the New York Times, as a child he was fond of the number 99 streetcar, which he used as his inspiration for the road's tag. 2. The interstate is part of the US's atomic attack plan. A major concern during Eisenhower's presidency was what the country would do in the event of a nuclear attack. One of the justifications for the building of the interstate system was its ability to evacuate citizens of major cities if necessary. 1. There are no design rules dictating the shape of roads. A major myth of the interstate system is that 1 out of every 5 miles is straight so an airplane can land. While this has happened, there are no rules or regulations that require such a design. Also, there are no requirements for curves to be designed into a highway to keep drivers awake. However, the Federal Highway Administration does admit that this is a perk of winding roads. Do share with us in the comments if you've more information about this highway. Please subscribe to The Luxury World. Thanks for watching.